The avoidant does not fall in love with people. They fall in love with possibility. Possibility asks nothing of them. Possibility does not demand presence, depth, or surrender. It lives safely in the mind, where nothing can wound them. And so the option, the distant, undefined, incomplete option, begins to shine brighter than the real choice standing before them. Why does this happen? Because the real choice is alive, it breathes, it has needs, it reflects them back to themselves, and to be reflected is to be exposed. The avoidant fears not closeness, but self-confrontation. When someone truly chooses them, when someone is available, consistent, and present, a mirror appears. And in that mirror are all the unhealed parts, the unspoken fears, the unresolved wounds. The mind recoils. It says this is too much, not because the other is demanding, but because the soul has not yet learned how to stand naked in truth. So the avoidant turns toward options. Options are seductive because they are unfinished. An option cannot disappoint you because it has never fully arrived. An option cannot ask you to grow because it has no roots. It is like worshiping the horizon while refusing to walk the path. The horizon is beautiful, but it will never hold you when you fall. Here is the deeper psychology. The mind values what it cannot have because it remains under imagination's control. The unavailable becomes perfect. The distant becomes divine. And the present becomes ordinary. Not because it is ordinary, but because it is real. Reality requires participation. Reality requires risk, and risk requires faith. This is where wisdom enters. Life itself is not an option. It is a commitment. Every breath you take is a declaration that you are here. You did not come into this world to hover at the edge of experience, collecting exits, rehearsing escape. You came to embody, to engage, to choose fully. Avoidance is a misunderstanding of freedom. Freedom is not the absence of attachment. Freedom is the courage to stand in love without armor. The avoidant says, I want freedom, but what they mean is, I do not want to be hurt. Yet pain is not the enemy. Unconsciousness is. When you treat options better than your real choice, you are worshiping potential instead of honoring presence. You are bowing to what might be, while neglecting what already is. And life does not reward hesitation. Life responds to devotion. There is a divine principle here. What you refuse to commit to, you cannot receive fully. Grace flows where responsibility is accepted. Depth comes where fear is faced. The real choice, whether it is a person, a calling, or a path, arrives with weight. And that weight is not a burden, it is grounding. It anchors you to the now. It invites you to grow beyond the mind's endless calculations. The avoidant believes they are protecting themselves. In truth, they are postponing their own becoming. Because transformation does not happen in possibility, it happens in presence. When you choose what is real, you step out of the mind and into life. You stop negotiating with fear, you stop romanticizing distance, you stop running from mirrors, and in that moment something sacred occurs. You become trustworthy to yourself. Not everything that feels intense is meaningful. Not everything that feels safe is right. Wisdom is knowing the difference. The option sparkles because it is empty. The real choice feels heavy because it is full. Choose fullness. Choose what asks you to show up. Choose what reveals you to yourself. The avoidant personality often lives under the illusion that distance equals freedom. In their inner world, stepping back feels like reclaiming power, as if emotional space were the same as sovereignty. But this is a misunderstanding rooted not in truth, but in fear. Freedom is not the absence of connection, it is the ability to remain present without losing oneself. Yet the avoidant mind has learned, often early, often silently, that closeness threatens identity, safety, or control. And so distance becomes a strategy, not a virtue. What they call freedom is frequently a nervous system response. Somewhere in their past, intimacy became associated with overwhelm, intrusion, or emotional instability. The body remembers what the mind tries to rationalize. When someone draws close, the avoidant does not consciously think, I am afraid. Instead, they feel a subtle tightening, a restlessness, a need to escape. The mind then supplies a story. I need space. I don't want to be tied down. I value independence. These explanations sound mature, even enlightened, but they are often defenses wearing the mask of wisdom. Control plays a central role here. Distance feels controllable. When someone is kept at arm's length, the avoidant can manage how much of themselves is seen. They can regulate vulnerability, decide when to engage and when to withdraw. This creates the illusion of mastery. But control is not freedom, it is a response to fear of chaos. True freedom does not require constant management. It arises from inner stability, the confidence that one can remain intact even when emotionally close to another. The tragedy is that the avoidant confuses self-protection with self-respect. They believe they are honoring their boundaries, when in reality they are reinforcing walls that keep growth out as much as pain. Distance may reduce immediate anxiety, but it also prevents the deep regulation that only safe connection can provide. Over time, this pattern teaches the nervous system that closeness is dangerous and solitude is safety, even when solitude becomes lonely and unfulfilling. Another layer of this confusion is the belief that needing others is weakness. The avoidant often prides themselves on self-sufficiency. They admire independence, resilience, and emotional restraint. Yet this belief ignores a fundamental truth of human psychology: we are wired for connection. Interdependence is not a flaw, it is a biological and spiritual reality. To deny this is not strength, it is resistance to one's own design. Distance also protects the avoidant from accountability. When you stay emotionally removed, you are less likely to be challenged, mirrored, or called to grow. Intimacy has a way of exposing patterns, defenses, inconsistencies, emotional blind spots. For someone who equates exposure with danger, avoidance feels like peace. But it is a shallow peace, maintained by constant withdrawal. It is the quiet of stagnation, not the stillness of inner harmony. What appears as freedom is often just familiarity. The avoidant knows how to be alone. They know how to disengage. They know how to survive without leaning too deeply into another. This familiarity is mistaken for preference. But comfort is not truth. Just because a pattern feels natural does not mean it is aligned. Many cages feel safe once you've lived in them long enough. At its core, the avoidance distance is not a rejection of others, but a rejection of uncertainty. Closeness introduces variables, emotions, needs, expectations that cannot be fully controlled. And so the avoidant retreats into the known, the manageable, the emotionally sparse. Yet life, by its very nature, is uncertain. Love, growth, and meaning all exist beyond the reach of control. Freedom is not found by escaping intimacy, but by developing the inner capacity to stay present within it. Until that capacity is built, distance will always masquerade as choice, while fear quietly holds the reins. Options feel safer to the avoidant because they exist without demand. An option does not require consistency, emotional investment, or the courage to remain present when discomfort arises. It is a psychological space where desire can exist without responsibility. In this space, the avoidant can taste connection without surrendering control, because nothing real is at stake. There is no need to show up fully, no expectation to be known, and no risk of being truly affected. Commitment, on the other hand, requires embodiment. It asks a person to move from imagination into lived experience. For the avoidant, this shift can feel threatening. As long as something remains an option, it stays in the realm of thought, where it can be idealized, edited, and kept safe. The moment it becomes real, it begins to interact with unresolved fears. Reality brings friction, and friction exposes what has not been healed. Options are safe because they are incomplete. They allow the avoidant to remain emotionally agile, always able to pivot, withdraw, or reframe. This flexibility feels empowering, but it is often rooted in the fear of being trapped. The avoidant equates commitment with loss of autonomy, loss of self, loss of escape. An option, by contrast, preserves every exit. It offers the comfort of knowing that nothing is final, and therefore nothing can fully wound them. There is also a neurological dimension to this pattern. The avoidant nervous system is often sensitized to intimacy. When connection deepens, the body may register threat rather than safety. Heart rate changes, muscles tense, the urge to create distance emerges. Options do not activate this response as strongly because they do not require sustained closeness. The body remains regulated, and the mind interprets this calm as clarity. But calm is not always truth. It can also be avoidance of activation. Another reason options feel safer is that they allow the avoidant to stay in control of their self-image. In committed connection, imperfections are revealed over time, needs surface, emotional patterns repeat. This can challenge the avoidance internal narrative of being self-contained and unaffected. Options protect that narrative. They allow the avoidant to remain an idea rather than a person, interesting, desirable, but never fully tested by reality. Options also protect against disappointment. When nothing is fully chosen, nothing can fully fail. The avoidant can always say, consciously or unconsciously, it was never that serious. This creates immodio. Insulation. Disappointment requires expectation, and expectation requires investment. By keeping things optional, the avoidant limits both. But in doing so, they also limit joy, depth, and genuine intimacy. The safety of options is amplified by fantasy. The mind fills in the gaps with idealized projections. Because the option is not fully known, it can be imagined as perfect. There are no daily irritations, no conflicts, no moments of emotional labor. The option remains pure, untouched by reality. This makes it emotionally appealing, especially compared to a real connection that includes complexity and imperfection. The avoidant then mistakes fantasy for compatibility and distance for depth. What often goes unrecognized is that safety achieved through avoidance is temporary and shallow. It reduces immediate anxiety but reinforces long-term disconnection. The nervous system learns that withdrawal equals relief, and this learning becomes habitual. Over time, the avoidant may feel chronically unfulfilled, restless, or disconnected, without understanding why. They have chosen safety over aliveness, control over communion. True safety does not come from keeping options open. It comes from developing the capacity to remain present in uncertainty. Commitment feels dangerous not because it is inherently harmful, but because it exposes the parts of the self that have not yet learned how to trust. Until those parts are addressed, options will continue to feel like refuge. But refuge is not home, and safety without depth eventually becomes its own form of emptiness. The human mind has a peculiar tendency to elevate what it cannot fully reach and diminish what it already holds. This is not romance, it is psychology. When something is unavailable, undefined, or distant, the mind fills the empty space with imagination. In that space, there are no contradictions, no disappointments, no ordinary moments. The mind paints the unreachable in ideal colors, not because it is better, but because it is incomplete. What is close, by contrast, is known, and what is known becomes vulnerable to judgment. For the avoidant, this mental habit becomes especially pronounced. Availability feels heavy, while distance feels light. The real person, the real connection, exists in time and reality. It requires attention, patience, and emotional labor. The unavailable option exists outside of time. It is untouched by routine, conflict, or responsibility. As a result, the mind assigns it greater value, not because it offers more, but because it asks for less. This idealization is a defense mechanism. When something is close, it has the power to affect us. It can disappoint us, challenge us, or reflect parts of ourselves we would rather not see. By elevating the distant and devaluing the present, the avoidant reduces emotional risk. The mind says, what I have is not enough, not because it is lacking, but because admitting its worth would require deeper engagement. Distance protects against vulnerability by turning desire into fantasy. There is also a cognitive bias at work. Scarcity increases perceived value. What is limited appears precious. What is always there feels replaceable. The avoidant mind leans heavily on this bias, mistaking emotional unavailability for depth and consistency for boredom. When someone is present and reliable, the nervous system may not spike with intensity. The avoidant then interprets this calm as a lack of attraction, unaware that peace can feel unfamiliar when one is conditioned to associate love with tension or uncertainty. The real choice also carries responsibility. When something is present, one must respond to it. There are expectations, spoken or unspoken, to care, to consider, to reciprocate. The distant option carries none of this weight. It can be admired without obligation. The mind prefers admiration over participation, because participation requires risk, and so the present is quietly downgraded, not because it is less meaningful, but because it is more demanding. Over time, this pattern reshapes perception itself. The avoidant begins to see availability as a flaw. Consistency becomes predictability. Predictability becomes dullness, and dullness becomes disinterest. Meanwhile, inconsistency is reframed as mystery, emotional distance as depth, and absence as longing. The mind confuses stimulation with connection. What activates anxiety feels alive, what brings steadiness feels empty. This distortion has consequences. By devaluing what is real, the avoidant undermines their own capacity for fulfillment. The present moment is where intimacy grows, where trust forms, where shared meaning is built. When it is dismissed, life becomes a series of almosts, almost connections, almost love, almost depth. The mind stays busy chasing ideals while the heart remains untouched. There is also a subtle form of self-rejection embedded in this pattern. When someone chooses the avoidant and stays, it challenges their internal belief about themselves. Being valued without struggle can feel undeserved or suspicious. Idealizing the unreachable allows the avoidant to maintain a familiar narrative, longing without receiving, desire without fulfillment. This keeps emotional distance intact, even as the mind insists it is searching for something more. What the avoidant often fails to see is that the real choice is not ordinary, it is simply honest. It reveals its imperfections openly. It does not rely on mystery to maintain value, but the mind, addicted to illusion, struggles to recognize the sacred in the simple, and so it reaches outward, toward what cannot be held, while quietly letting go of what is already offering itself fully. Avoidance is often misunderstood as a lack of interest or an inability to love, but at its core it is neither. It is not the absence of desire for connection, nor is it a rejection of others. It is a resistance to inner vulnerability. The avoidant does not step back because they do not care, they step back because caring awakens parts of themselves they have learned to keep hidden. Closeness stirs emotions that feel unsafe, unfamiliar, or overwhelming, and withdrawal becomes the method of emotional self-preservation. Vulnerability requires contact with one's inner world. It invites awareness of fear, longing, dependency, and uncertainty. For someone with avoidant tendencies, these inner experiences may feel disorganizing. They may have grown up in environments where emotions were ignored, dismissed, or punished, teaching them that expressing need leads to disappointment or loss of control. As a result, they learn to rely on self-sufficiency, turning inward not to connect, but to contain. When another person comes close, they unknowingly challenge this inner structure. Intimacy asks the avoidant to soften defenses that once kept them safe. It asks them to admit that they are affected, that they need, that they care. These admissions can feel like danger, not because they are inherently harmful, but because the avoidant has not developed the internal capacity to hold them without fear. Withdrawal then becomes a way to regain emotional equilibrium. This resistance is deeply internalized. The avoidant may genuinely believe that others are asking for too much, that relationships are draining, or that closeness threatens autonomy. These beliefs are not deliberate distortions. They are protective interpretations shaped by experience. The real threat is not the other person, but the emotional exposure that connection brings. By framing the discomfort as external pressure, the avoidant avoids confronting the vulnerability within. Avoidance also serves to maintain an internal sense of coherence. Vulnerability introduces uncertainty. It disrupts familiar narratives about identity, strength, and independence. To feel deeply connected to another is to risk losing emotional clarity, to risk being influenced, changed, or moved. For someone who equates stability with control, this influence can feel destabilizing. Retreating restores a sense of self that feels known and manageable. There is often shame beneath this resistance. Needing someone can feel humiliating if one has learned that needs are weaknesses. Depending on another can feel like failure if one's worth has been tied to independence. Rather than face this shame, the avoidant distances themselves, telling a story of preference or principle. In doing so, they protect not only their emotions, but their self-image. Ironically, avoidance does not eliminate vulnerability, it merely displaces it. The feelings do not disappear, they remain unprocessed, surfacing as restlessness, numbness, or quiet loneliness. The avoidant may pride themselves on emotional control, yet feel disconnected from meaning and depth. This is the cost of resisting vulnerability, safety without intimacy, control without fulfillment. The tragedy is that vulnerability is not a threat to the self. It is the gateway to integration. When emotions are allowed, they organize rather than overwhelm. When needs are acknowledged, they soften rather than dominate. But this truth can only be discovered through experience, not theory. Until then, the avoidant remains caught in a loop. seeking connection while resisting the very openness that makes connection possible. What appears as rejection is often fear turned inward. The avoidant is not saying no to the other, they are saying no to the parts, themselves they do not yet know how to hold. True choice is often romanticized as freedom without cost, but in reality it carries weight. To choose is to step out of ambiguity and into responsibility. For the avoidant, this weight can feel unbearable, not because they lack capacity, but because they have learned to associate responsibility with loss of options, loss of control, loss of escape. Yet without responsibility, choice remains an illusion, something imagined rather than lived. Courage is the first requirement of real choice. Not the loud, dramatic kind, but the quiet courage to remain present when fear arises. Choosing means staying when the mind urges withdrawal, listening when the impulse is to shut down, and engaging when detachment feels safer. This courage is not about forcing oneself into discomfort, but about allowing discomfort without fleeing from it. Avoidance is easy, presence is demanding, but only presence allows life to deepen. Responsibility follows courage. When something is chosen, it must be tended, emotions must be acknowledged, communication maintained, and impact considered. This responsibility can feel like confinement to someone accustomed to keeping emotional distance. Yet responsibility is not a cage, it is a container. It gives structure to connection, allowing trust to grow. Without it, relationships remain fragile, undefined, and easily abandoned. To choose is also to be seen. Commitment removes the protective fog of ambiguity. There is no longer the safety of partial engagement or plausible deniability. One's patterns, fears, and limitations become visible. This exposure can feel threatening, especially to someone who has relied on self-containment for security. But being seen is not annihilation, it is recognition. It is the moment when the self steps into reality instead of hiding behind potential. The avoidant often believes that keeping options open preserves autonomy. In truth, it preserves indecision. Autonomy is not the ability to escape, but the ability to stand in one's decisions without collapse. This stability is built through responsibility, not avoidance. Each time a person chooses and remains, they strengthen their capacity to tolerate uncertainty, conflict, and emotional complexity. Over time, what once felt overwhelming becomes manageable. There is also a spiritual dimension to choice. Every genuine choice aligns the individual with consequence. It says, "I accept what follows from this decision." This acceptance is an act of faith, faith that one can respond to life as it unfolds. Avoidance rejects this faith, attempting to secure certainty before engagement. But certainty is never guaranteed. Meaning arises not from perfect outcomes, but from committed participation. Being willing to be seen means relinquishing the fantasy of control over how one is perceived. It means allowing misunderstandings, imperfections, and vulnerability to exist in the open. For the avoidant, this can awaken old fears of judgment or abandonment. Yet it is precisely this openness that allows intimacy to form. Without visibility, there is no true meeting, only parallel solitude. True choice also involves grief. When one path is chosen, others are left behind. The avoidant often resists this grief, clinging to options to avoid feeling the loss of what might have been. But grief is not a sign of error, it is evidence of depth. To feel it is to honor the reality of choice. To avoid it is to remain suspended in indecision, untouched by consequence, and therefore untouched by growth. In the end, real choice is not about guaranteeing safety. It is about trusting oneself enough to face whatever emerges. Courage, responsibility, and visibility are not burdens. They are the price of aliveness. Without them, one may feel free but remain unfulfilled, forever circling possibility without ever arriving. Thank you for listening with an open mind and an open heart. May these words stay with you where reflection begins. Goodbye for now, and may clarity, courage, and conscious choice guide your path forward. In the end, the journey from avoidance to awareness is not about learning how to choose others differently, but about learning how to choose life more honestly. When we stop mistaking distance for freedom, options for safety, and fantasy for depth, we begin to return to ourselves. What is real may feel heavier, but it is also where meaning lives. Commitment is not the loss of freedom, it is the discovery of purpose. When you choose with courage, accept responsibility, and allow yourself to be seen, you step out of fear and into truth. And in that truth, connection becomes not a threat, but a sacred mirror through which growth unfolds. Thank you for giving your attention, your presence, and your willingness to reflect beyond the surface. Goodbye, and may wisdom guide your choices. Courage steady your heart, and awareness lead you home.